Hello and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by Compliance Week and Archive 360. I'm Jeffrey Dale with Compliance Week and I'll be your host. Today's webcast is Accepting the Risk in Your Data, a practitioner's approach to living with data risk. Before we hear from our presenters, let me review the agenda. We're scheduled to go for 1 hour. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. Your questions will be kept confidential and anonymous, so please don't be shy. You can ask your questions at any time using the Ask a Question function on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'll pose them to our guests at the end of their presentation. After the Q&A, I'll wrap up the webcast. This webcast will also offer CPE credit for all attendees. Please use Google Chrome or Firefox as your internet browser and disable your pop-up blockers to ensure access to the exam. Once I've signed off and the webcast is completely over, the final examination will be presented automatically in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to webcasts@complianceweek.com. Once again, to ensure receipt of your CPE credit, please use Google Chrome or Firefox as your internet browser. If you've missed anything, I'll repeat these instructions at the end of the webcast, so stay tuned. A few other administrative details. At any time during the presentation, listeners can download the slides from a drop-down menu on the left-hand side of your screen. There you will also find the feedback form for the webcast. We welcome your thoughts as we are always looking to improve your experience. If you wish to increase the slide size, you can hit the View Slide Full Screen button at the top right of your screen. And lastly, a Help button is located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen for assistance. I'd like to welcome today's speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce Jay Cohen, Senior Consultant with CSLG. Jay is a former Chief Compliance Officer with information services and insurance companies. He was a Managing Director in the Insurance Risk Advisory practice at Deloitte, helping companies strengthen their compliance programs and address remediation of regulatory settlement agreements. We also have Mark Diamond, President and CEO at Conturl. Mark is recognized as an industry thought leader in proactive records and information management, litigation readiness, and risk and compliance strategies. I'd like to also welcome Dan Manners, Vice President, Product Strategy at Archive 360. Dan has 35 plus years of experience as a real-world practitioner in the financial and consulting industry focused on emerging technologies, regulatory compliance, data privacy, CIPM certified, and in information governance. Great to have you all with us. With that, I'll turn it over to Dan to get us started.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jeffrey. Just before we kick off, I thought maybe Jay and Mark could do a super quick intro, so at least everybody starts to get acclimated to the faces on the screen. Jay, you first.
Thanks, Dan. I want to thank Archive 360 and Compliance Week for putting this program together. It's a very important topic, and for giving me the opportunity to contribute to it, and thank everybody for giving us some of your time. The only thing I'll add to my bio is that both as a compliance officer and as a compliance consultant, these are issues that I've dealt with throughout that time. I've been in your shoes, and I can appreciate the challenges and the opportunities that these issues present.
Great. Mark?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Mark Diamond, and just want to encourage everybody to ask lots of questions. We're going to try and fit those in and be able to do that. And if we talk about something that you're not familiar with, or we use a term, or you just want to make a statement, let's make this as interactive as possible.
Great. Thanks, Mark and Jay. So Dan Manners, I think I'll do very similar to Mark and be very speedy through this. The only correction I really have to my bio is only to correct the fact is that not maybe necessarily 35 years, but some years less than that. But I've also been in many of your shoes as well as a real world practitioner. And I think much of that really comes out, that perspective, again, as part of really today's discussion. So with that, I'm going to kick off really the presentation. And I want to say again that we're really excited at today's session and when we do have a full agenda. And what we're expecting to bring you all through in today's discussion is really a view of the obligations that are imposed upon your organization, how those obligations are evolving over time, some common challenges that many of us consistently face within our current environments, and last but certainly not least, in a very logical order, Mark will really bring us through a bit about the practical steps in both managing a program and establishing good governance frameworks. Really very important, and I hope that the discussion will be, as Mark said, lively and well received. So to set a little bit of the context here, we've presented, 2 slides, and then we'll start to really get a bit more into the discussion in itself. And this first slide is really trying to represent, again, basically the growth of data that's over from 21 to 26. And what's important to really kind of see here, and I think everybody intuitively really kind of understands that growth is growing exponentially. Now here we're really highlighting the fact that there's still a distinction between unstructured and structured, but the reality is, as many of us are operating in these environments, is that distinction, the structured versus unstructured, is very likely to change. And a lot of that really gets influenced by new technologies, such as generative AI, of which you'll be hard-pressed to find any presentation which doesn't at least use some of the buzzwords like generative AI. But what's really very important to understand is that those technologies really have an effect onto the growth of the data, of which that many of us are here to speak about and to talk about and to better manage, especially as relates to risk. And the primary takeaway from this kind of slide is that, frankly, that at these scales, at the volume and the velocity of the data that's being generated and which will continue to be generated, is really that there is no way to look at these types of things in a manual or even really consistently taking a legacy approach to how we consistently work. And the second big takeaway is really about that, frankly, now we're really talking about technology as both a driver to the data and to the risk that we're producing, as well as being part of the governance framework that we all need to develop. If we look forward a little bit, so one of the things that, again, hard-pressed for anybody to really talk about any topic within this realm and not really touch upon generative AI and stuff. But one of the things, what we didn't want to really kind of do today was really dive into that topic because, frankly, that's something that's worth its own session. And there's many different kind of perspectives about how it really will affect many of our lives. What is really important here is that while obviously generative AI is a watershed event, it's obviously driving and will continue to drive an enormous amount of data, and everybody is expecting that evolution to grow and frankly grow very quickly. Even if we take a look back at when ChatGPT came out, which is in 22, to where we are now, there's been huge leaps as well. So where we are really focused on today is that even with all this excitement around generative AI and the use of AI more in general, for the purposes of today, really what we want to focus on is that ultimately it all boils down to data sitting in your estate, and frankly, meeting the core obligations that many of us need to adhere to on a daily basis. So after we strip it all away, it all leads down to the same levels of perspective about how we are managing that data. And now clearly growth will be a significant factor. So I don't want to lead too much, but that sets, I think, a bit of the stage. And I'm going to now leave it off with Jay, who's going to take us to the next section. Jay, let me cue up your slide, and if you'd like.
All right, thanks, Dan. So Dan's done a great job of putting some color, literally, around something that all of you on this program already know all too well. There's a lot more information, and the information is growing. That growth is not slowing down. That data is more widely dispersed than ever. It's all over the place, structured and unstructured, and new technologies are adding to your risks. So my job over the next several slides is to discuss the obligations, the risks, and the costs that accompany all of that data: legal, regulatory, reputational, business. And in the process, I want to share my own journey from save everything to defensible disposition of data. And in doing that, I want to arm you with the information you need to plan a similar journey and to encourage, to convince your legal and compliance colleagues to join you along the way. My job, why you should do this, and then Mark's going to help you understand how to do it and how to make it work. So before we get to that slide that we just saw there, let me just quickly talk about my personal journey. I started my compliance career in 1996 at a major insurance company, which was in the midst of a class action lawsuit and an investigation by every insurance state regulator across the country. In the course of that matter, the court ordered us to save and retain paper documents related to tens of thousands of policyholders over the course of 2 decades. I went around to every one of our thousands of sales offices to get them to retain literally boxes of documents, because at the time, all of the risks that were driving our records and information management program were around making sure we saved everything we needed for these matters. Go 20 years later, and I'm working for an insurance company, and we decided to try and find out how many social security numbers there were in the unstructured data that all of our employees had. And we leveraged a tool, and we found out that there were literally tens of thousands of social security numbers sitting across the organization. People had social security numbers in their emails, in their share files. Some people didn't even realize they were had, and most people didn't need them. But every single one of those social security numbers was a potential risk to the company. So now we've gone from we need to save everything to maybe that's not the right approach. I was involved in another project at Deloitte in which we decided to look for rot at a company, redundant, obsolete, and trivial information in unstructured data systems like email and share files. And we asked these questions. How much of that data is stored in these unstructured systems? What are its characteristics? How old is it? How sensitive is it? What's in it? How much of that data is eligible for and should already have been destroyed? And how does the volume and value of that data vary by location and business unit? And here's what we found. We found a lot of very old emails and other files way beyond their retention period. We found files that belonged to people who were no longer employed with the company. We found lots of data that duplicated other data. And a lot of that rot had sensitive, personal, or other information in it. And what may be most interesting to this audience is we identified a group of heavy hitters that by far had the most rot in their files. A lot of them were in the legal and compliance departments. So, and we go to the next slide, Dan. What I mean by setting this stage is that what I learned over the course of that time is that more is no longer better. The balance of legal, regulatory, and reputational risks is shifting. And I want to give you some of the reasons behind that shift and some of the reasons why you and your organizations need to think about defensible disposition versus saving everything. First, failure to minimize data increases the risks and consequences of breaches. Obviously, something can't be hacked if it's not around anymore. And let me just read you one example. a major grocery chain settled a case with the New York Attorney General. Not only paid a significant fine, but had to make some significant changes in its information management systems. And here's what the Attorney General of New York said. The affected information that was breached included driver's license numbers, but the company did not have a reasonable business purpose for maintaining any form of driver's license information indefinitely. The company paid a fine, and it was specifically ordered to establish and maintain appropriate policies and procedures to ensure that personal information is deleted when there's no reasonable purpose to retain it. So that company took on a legal and regulatory and reputational risk that it did not have to take on. The second point I want to make is that data privacy and security regulations increasingly include data minimization, right up there with encryption and all the other things that companies are supposed to do to protect data. And here's one example. The FTC settled a case against a company in which it found that that company failed to have a policy and procedure for inventorying and deleting consumers' personal information on its network. And that company was ordered to implement policies, procedures, and technical measures to systematically inventory personal information and delete personal information that was no longer necessary. Data minimization also is increasingly an express part of data privacy and security regulations. The California data privacy and security regulations specifically say that businesses shall not retain a consumer's personal information or sensitive personal information for longer than necessary for the reason that that information is collected in the first place. And the Attorney General of California recently encouraged all Californians to utilize their privacy rights, including, in his words, their right to request that a business delete personal information that it no longer is necessary to have. Insurance companies are now obligated under a state insurance regulation model law that over 20 states have adopted to define and periodically evaluate a mechanism for the destruction of non-public personal information when it's no longer needed. And the states of Virginia and California have expressly included purpose limitations in their privacy regulations. And here's the thing. These are not just issues for financial services. These are issues for all of us. And let me give you 3 examples. A bipartisan group of 33 state attorneys general asked the Federal Trade Commission, which is considering new privacy rules that will apply across the board, to include data minimization requirements in those rules, because those rules will help businesses evaluate and mitigate potential harms to their customers. New York has a new SHIELD Act, which applies to almost all businesses that do business there, relating to how they manage data and provide information about data breaches. And that act expressly requires that the safeguards that these companies must have around their information will include disposing of private information within a reasonable amount of time after it is no longer needed for business purposes. And finally, for those of you that operate in Europe, the GDPR has data minimization requirements, and the regulators have already brought cases around data minimization. So more is no longer better. And Dan, if we go on to the next slide.
And Jay, I just want to give a brief comment on that if I can.
Please do.
Jay, thank you for highlighting. I mean, there's a lot of risk of over-retention. And talked about the cost, the personal information, the privacy, the other rules associated with that. And there's also pretty significant productivity risks. I just want to throw in, be a little bit careful, however. A lot of discussions around data minimization, we've worked with a lot of companies that say, hey, we're just going to go delete all the emails, or we're going to delete all the files. And they can make a very strong argument that these are non-records, expired records, low-value business information. But be careful, because sometimes if you aggressively go delete a lot of data, you drive a counter behavior from employees that we call underground archiving. What happens is employees say, oh my gosh, they're taking our stuff. And then they start squirreling away their data, and it can be either in file shares, or it can be in web-based applications or Dropbox or someplace else like that. And they're saying, oh, I just need this stuff. And they don't really need it, but they think they do. And that moving the data where you can't control it actually makes the problem much worse. And so it is possible to reduce and do a lot of defensible disposition, but be very careful be smart about how you do it. It is doable, but be smart about how you do it with a really starting from an approach where you're controlling the information to begin with.
And that's something that I know we're going to talk about a little bit later, and I know you're going to spend some time on. But none of this can be done sort of in a vacuum, or none of this can be done only on its own. Now, these regulations, these settlements, these cases, all approach data minimization as part of privacy and security for the reasons that are on this slide. The more data you have, the more it costs to keep it. The more data you have, the harder it is to secure, and the greater the risk of a data breach. And lots of companies get breached, and this can happen. If it hasn't already, it can happen to any of your organizations. When you have too much data, it can be difficult to find what you need when you need it in a timely fashion. And as we just talked about, compliance with regulations can be extremely difficult. And it's not just compliance with regulations, it's obligations to your customers. We all promise our customers when we get information from them that we're going to treat it in the right way. And whether those promises come from regulation or they come from our commitments to them as organizations, those are things that customers take very seriously. And I want to just end this particular slide by kind of summing it up by reading you some language from a recent data breach class action that was filed against a major company that suffered a data breach. And this is what the lawyers said in that class action. Defendant had obligations created by law, by contract, by industry standards, and by the reputations it made to its customers to keep their personal information confidential and protect it from unauthorized transfer and access. Among the things that the defendant did not do, according to this class action, was not just failing to encrypt the information, but failing to delete that information when it was no longer needed. That company, according to this class action, had a duty to exercise appropriate practices to remove former customers' personal information that it was no longer required. And to sort of sum this up, the defendant breached the contract, the implied contract it made with its customers by failing to safeguard and protect their information and by failing to delete that information once the customer relationship ended. So the over-retention, particularly of sensitive information, can create all sorts of problems. Let's go on to the next slide. As Dan has already sort of set the stage, your challenges in this regard, and the challenges along the lines of what Mark was talking about, to make sure that you prevent, at the same time you prevent over-retention, you don't encourage underground archiving. Those challenges are made even greater by all of the technology changes in the landscape. I like to look at this sort of this way. I come from Pittsburgh, which, given the state of our football team on Sunday, is not necessarily the right place to be from today. But in Pittsburgh, everything we do revolves around the confluence. Pittsburgh sits at the confluence of two rivers, the Monongahela and the Allegheny, which come together to form the Ohio. So the data management challenges that you have are sort of the mighty Ohio River. And they come from two places. One, all of the regulations and the class action lawsuits and the commitments that I was just talking about. And the other are all of the technology changes that make those challenges even greater. The first is the explosive, and let's go on to the next slide. The first is the explosive growth in information, including structured and unstructured data that Dan started us off by talking about. The second are new forms of communication, things like text and instant messaging. And for those of you in the financial services area, you're well aware of the fact that the SEC and the CFTC have now imposed over $2 billion worth of penalties against financial services companies because they failed to manage business communications that were taking place through text and instant messaging. I mean, I go back to the days when all of the angst around retention and regulation related to email. Well, now we've got these new forms of communication. There are new forms of technology, as Dan talked about, that incorporate and generate information. And they are starting to create legal and regulatory challenges around data. A prominent insurance company is facing a lawsuit because the allegation in those lawsuits is that its use of AI in its claims management has created a disparate impact, that bias embedded in the AI is creating improper results in the exercise of the claims management function at that company. But it's not just financial services where these issues come up. In May of 2023, a U.S. district court sanctioned a company for failing to preserve internal chat messages in the course of antitrust litigation. I found an article in the Wall Street Journal in which an executive's pay was docked because he had deleted texts that were on his personal phone, texts that were subject to a legal hold. And going back as far as 2019, there have been cases in which companies have been sanctioned for failing to preserve and produce communications through Slack. And probably most important for all of you, the U.S. Department of Justice has made how companies manage compliance and manage new information technologies part of how it will evaluate the effectiveness of a company's compliance program. Updated standards for the evaluations of corporate compliance programs say that prosecutors should consider a corporation's policies and procedures governing the use of personal devices, communications platforms, and messaging applications. And as all of you are well aware, the DOJ standards for the effectiveness of compliance programs have an impact far beyond just what happens in the federal criminal justice system. So the fact that this issue is now included in those standards is going to have a major impact well beyond. And before I close this side, I just want to add one more thing, and that is one of the challenges, and this is something that we as compliance professionals face all the time, is the gap between the tools and technologies and methods of communication that the business uses and the tools and technologies and the resources that are available to compliance. I saw a very recent survey by Compliance Group in which they found that respondents' data retention policies and procedures We're falling behind the times with an over-reliance on manual processes. Half of the respondents described their data retention policies and procedures as fully manual. Most of the companies relied on human resources to put their data retention policies into action. So as the business gets more digitized and uses more technology, compliance has some work to do to catch up. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. So I just want to close my part of the presentation by going on to the next slide and sort of, I think we're all expected to ask these 4 questions. And I know Mark's going to spend a lot more time answering them. But at the end of the day, what business information do we have? Where is it and how is it being kept? What are the rules and business needs associated with that information? And how are we consistently implementing those rules and documenting our compliance? And again, when I started in '96 and we asked these 4 questions, it was all about making sure we saved everything we needed to save. But today, the challenge, for all the reasons that I just talked about, are a lot more complex and a lot more detailed than just simply answering these questions that way.
Great. Thanks, Jay. Can I move along?
Please do.
Good. All right. Well, we're going to move into the next stage of the presentation, if you will. So how to scale your legacy data risk in your program. And I'm going to lead off that discussion. So Jay, I have to kind of say, first off, phenomenal. Great information that I think everybody should be really kind of taking into heart. And a lot of the information that you said is really very relevant into kind of these next slides, both with myself and then with Mark. So terrific stuff. So moving along into kind of from the concept. So Jay was really talking about, quite a lot about obviously data minimization and data privacy. And one basic thing I think that we all kind of recognize as well is that the data, the information that resides within your information. So Jay was exposing some of the reasons of keeping some of that data. But ultimately, we're also talking about how it resides within your environment as well. And I think we recognize that there's this constant risk and this tension between the value of our information, which I think Jay touched on as well, and how that value of that information really works over time as relates to kind of the risk that you have within your organization. And so typically, risk within the organization is at best flat, and typically the longer that you're holding on to the data, as it even loses some value, which is arguable, is very interesting and brings upon different discussions. So one of the things for us to be really kind of thinking about is that, and Jay started to touch on some of these items as well as part of his discussion, is the evolving affirmative action, the obligations that we have to that data that sits within our environment. And Jay actually hit on it, frankly, a few different times about some of those challenges. So as we start to think about those affirmative obligations, there's some foundational principles I think that we all commonly recognize, or we should really recognize, right? So some of those are, so for example, the obligation to retain. So many of us are in industries of which that we have a firm obligation or legal or regulatory requirement to retain that information. But retention by itself isn't necessarily that full complex of what is meant. So we start to think about, as part of retaining that information, you need to maintain the integrity of the information. You need to be able to search and retrieve it. It has to be redundant and resilient, as called out by multiple regulations. You need to be able to extend that retention principle to third parties who you may be working with and have obligations. And what's become more and more prevalent is about audit trails and ensuring that you have proper trails for access, modifications, and deletion. Now, another foundational principle is preserve or hold, as many folks here understand who are embroiled in litigation and talking about discovery, right? Similar analogy in the FOIA requests, Freedom of Information requests. The fact is that systems need to be able to search and preserve and produce information when they are required to. Some of these challenges, and the reason why I'm bringing it up is because as we look at our data estate, you have different ages of systems that have grown over time. And it's very real in the fact of that some of these systems, which are older, can no longer or struggle with many of these very much foundational core concepts of which that we need to affirm that we can meet. The one I really like to kind of to discuss is also about disposal, right? And so that is kind of one of those very key requirements. So for the longest period of time, many people in many industries meant to meet their affirmative obligation about retention or preservation by, frankly, not disposing of data, right? That was a very common practice for a long time. And as kind of Jay points out, some of that paradigm has now changed in the fact of where there is this affirmative obligation to now minimize what it is that you're holding for the right purpose. And as we talk about data privacy and that minimization principle, there's two sides to that coin, right? So there is, frankly, the security side. Jay highlighted for us as well. So thank you, Jay. And equally, there is that opposite side of the coin in the fact of that, what's the obligation? So individuals have the ability or the legal right to ask organizations to do something about their data, right? Knowing how it's used, where it's being processed, how it's being collected, right? And the fact that they can ask for the deletion of that data. So all of this is really kind of resonating in a common theme about the intricacies of really managing your affirmative obligations on systems which over time age. And over that time, they struggle to meet some of these complexities as they continue to grow. Because the one thing that, frankly, either if you're in a regulatory environment or litigation, the expectation is that these are core foundational principles that you can apply to the data within your management. I'm going to move along a little bit, maybe speed it up just a bit. So two areas that I really wanted to highlight when we talk about this, this particular topic is about cybersecurity and legacy data. And this particular first point, cybersecurity breaches, 66% of organizations consider inside threats more likely than external. And I'm sure people have heard kind of variations of that along the way. And what's very interesting about that is, frankly, that it's not necessarily due to anything which is malicious. Many times, those breaches from internal threats are really, frankly, just because of neglect or because of human error. And some of that is due, again, in the fact of that they are exposed, as we talk about existing environments. It's about what you're doing within your existing environment. Sometimes it's also about what you're not doing within the environment. The second point is the second item is really to talk about the legacy data and applications, right? So ultimately, legacy applications are, frankly, systems or platforms which exist in your environment. And as we talked about the value of information and over time, is that some of these systems continue to maintain critical information of which you have an obligation for the affirmative obligations as I've just kind of described. But frankly, they are less used or they are less valuable than some of the more operationally current environments. And what tends to end up happening, and this is just simply in many industries, it's not indicative of one versus the other, is frankly, those systems don't get paid as much attention as the current operational systems. They tend to be difficult to patch. They, equally many times are just not revisited as to who are the folks who need access to that information and that data. And so there's very little management control per se about that environment. And this is really kind of all leading us to the fact of that this is just, I think, commonplace in many industries in that these systems and applications exist. And it leads us to basically the next concept here, which is about the concept of data retirement, right? And meaning that there is a very real case in taking data that is really from these legacy systems and ensuring that all of the deficiencies, some of which we've kind of highlighted quickly through the discussion here, are now being able to get better addressed within a common environment. Right, so things like, as we've kind of listed here, cybersecurity, the ability to really kind of take information that is on these legacy applications, which may no longer be patched, and being able to bring them into a common architecture, a common platform, to really take a look at then locking down that access. One of the very key principles of data privacy, for example, which is the next one, is really about ensuring only the people who need to have access to data have access to that data. And you'll find in many legacy environments, it's not true. So being able to consolidate onto common platforms to be able to follow this retirement approach, again, which isn't necessarily novel, but is a very good, sound practice of being able to employ to ensure we can meet our obligations. Data privacy, right? So as we talk about the right about data subject access requests, being able to find that data in a clear, effective, efficient way, again, benefits in driving forward in these common platforms. Legal discovery, is essential as part of, if it's within your custody and control. I'm sure Jay would kind of agree with that. In the fact, if it's in your custody, your control, you need to produce it. In many of these legacy systems, they simply are incapable to leverage third-party applications for e-discovery or be able to comprehensively find it. And with paying attention to regulatory retention, obviously, many of these legacy systems, they were never envisioned for this very long-term archiving process by which that we need to adhere to. And in some of those systems, it's quite frankly very expensive. And the last, I'll breeze right through it, is really kind of data sovereignty. So when you're taking an approach to be able to retire your data, and meaning not necessarily dispose of it, but to retire it into a system of which that you can better manage and control it, right? That's where you're taking the opportunities to look at and leveraging these AI tools and ML tools to better classify it and to be able to actually then put it or preserve it where it really should be. So very quickly, what does retirement look like? I'm going to give you a few kind of quick bits there, and then I'm going to hand off really to Mark, because I really want him to have adequate time to cover his topics. But cloud native. So in today's world, right, there's just no way to be able to compete with the investments that these public cloud providers supply, right? They surpass everybody's budget, and because they know where they really kind of need to focus their control. Customer control. For this is a personal pet peeve in mine of, through the ages of where I've had data residing with third parties, and it becomes very difficult to get that data back upon your control. In modern ways and approaches to data retirement, that is completely feasible to be within the customer control. For example, your data sitting in your public cloud under your tenant, completely feasible. Security is almost always a primary concern. It comes up in every discussion possible. Leveraging these cloud native solutions have all sorts of a myriad of security enticements about how you can encrypt your data, how you can manage the keys to that encryption, multiple layers of complexity to really ensure that your environment is as secure as possible. And the last piece I really wanted to touch upon, because it really deserves it, is that disposition. So while you're following this potential approach of consolidating into a retirement strategy, one of those real benefits is that, frankly, again, the legacy environments are struggling with the ability to identify and specifically dispose of data, and especially at bulk. And taking, again, the opportunity when leveraging into these more modern solutions, this is one of the real pros of being able to then have better classified data, which leads to the possibility of definitively disposing of that data. Okay, Mark, I'm going to hand off to you if you're prepared.
That sounds good. Thank you, Dan.
All right.
So next slide, please. So sometimes as compliance professionals, we may feel a little bit overwhelmed. We've got privacy, we've got cybersecurity risks, we've got data in retirement, I talked about this underground archiving, we got records requirements. We now AI. I mean, what's a practical way that we can be compliant, reduce risks, and hopefully do other things while still working in today's environment? Because we sit on these webinars and we may understand these risks, but to the business units we work with, to the other stakeholders in the organization, does everybody else get it? Not always, and that could be one of the frustrating parts. So I want to talk about, next slide, please, just a little bit about what are some of the practical ways. Now, we do information governance consulting. We work with about 30% of the Fortune 500. We've done a lot of these. I want to talk a little bit about the first way. One of the first areas is assess and plan. Figure out what your current capabilities are, and this is very important. Determine what your target maturity is. Do you want to be the Cadillac from compliance? Do you want to be the Chevy? Do you want to be the golf cart? Do you want to be the bicycle in compliance? What's the appropriate level of compliance? Because most of these regimes, for example, privacy, it is impossible to be perfect. You won't be perfect. And so we have to have some level of risk and some level of target maturity that we want to be on. And then let's start putting together those pieces on a strategic roadmap. Let's figure out what we want to do, in what order, and let's also make it reasonable, because every organization has a limit to how quickly it can absorb change and do things. The next step is, quite frankly, a lot of it's in policies. We see a lot of organizations updating their records retention policies. There's a major shift from more traditional records retention policies to what we call modern, compliant, easier to execute policies. These are policies that a good records retention schedule, for example, should address legitimate business need and what records have personal information, what's the legitimate business need for retaining that. Obviously, privacy policies, making sure that those are clear, in addition to the records retention schedule. By the way, don't have a separate data retention policy than a records retention schedule. Those are the same things. You want one of those, and we don't care what you call it, as well as data security classification. So sometimes organizations are trying to execute off of older, ineffective, difficult to execute policies. And so that's a first step. Second step. Next, we want to look at the technology. A lot of the problems we're talking about, technology, we don't sell or resell any products. And so I can say there's a lot of the technologies out there really good, and they can actually make it very easier to execute. But we have to be smart about how we're using the technology. And generally what the overall trend right now is we want to be able to manage all the information. We want to be able to control it. We want to be able to implement, we want to be able to do that. And getting the technology in there, I'm going a bit quickly on that. Think about the 5-second rule. If you want an employee to comply with your policy, if you want them to declare something as a record, if you want them to be compliant with legal hold, all their information, all their files and all their emails, they have to do all of those processes, including looking it up and tagging it and storing it in the right place in 5 seconds or less. If it takes longer than 5 seconds, even well-meaning employees are going to blow off your policy. And then it's a question of being able to customize that for individual environments. Next step is behavior change management. There is a win for employees as they go through and have a better organized information management environment. Now, this excludes, the compliance reasons, the compliant risks. I mean, we know about those. Instead of saying, hey, employees, we're going to go delete 80% of your files and emails because we find 80% of your files and emails expired records, low business value is what Jay called rot, redundant, obsolete, or trivial information. Maybe we can have a smarter message there. Maybe we can say, hey, 20% of your information is very valuable. Hey, we talked to you. Hey, this is stuff you use and you need. And we also figured out that 80% of your information, either Ms. or Mr. Employee, is low value. Let's go out and get rid of that. And that low value stuff is cluttering it up, making it really difficult for you to be able to find what you need, for you to be able to collaborate with other people. And so probably the most overlooked component of most of these programs is the behavior change management, which is, again, the messaging, training, communication. And finally, let's audit what we're doing. A policy does not compliance make, and we know that as compliance professionals. Having a fancy policy and not executing it is worse than having no policy whatsoever. What we want to do is saying, are we following our policy? Are we saving the right stuff? Are we getting rid of it? Are we protecting this information, this personal information? And then if we find an issue, we go and remediate that. Sometimes I see some organizations are afraid to do audits because they're afraid what they're going to find. Well, guess what? We know these are inherently imperfect processes. We know it's highly likely that we're going to find some part of our program that's not working as well as it should. That's okay. A defensible program comes from following your policy and actually demonstrating an audit and then remediating it. And that's a very big part of it. So I'm just touching on a whole number of issues out there. Next slide, please.
Sure.
I'm
Mark,
sorry, what?
No, just chiming in on your point really about audit. And it's a completely valuable tool to organizations in order to, frankly, not only expose where some of the challenges are, but frankly, to be able to leverage it for change. Right. So
yes.
By exposing it, it's an incredibly powerful internal tool that's many times overlooked. So I appreciate that point. So
how do we align the right stakeholders in the organization? And what is it that we actually need to do? And so why don't we go to the next slide and talk a little bit about this, as I'm almost out of time. Compliance is not a one woman or one man or one person job. It's really, it takes a team. And whether it's executing a records retention schedule, or implementing privacy, or anti-corruption, or collaboration, or the retirement of this, it takes a team of different people to be able to do that. We have seen the very best compliance programs, information governance programs, is where we have a number of the stakeholders there, which is compliance, legal, IT, privacy, information security, and especially the business units. We want to include them early in the process, and we want to know what they are. And even if, a lot of the business units don't necessarily have a lot of subject matter expertise in some of these compliance issues, but we're not bringing them in for subject matter expertise. What we want to do is have them be part of the process of us not only being more compliant, but running the business better and being smarter. And it's just sort of human nature. When you're out there and you take this holistic approach, and when you include different stakeholders, you get a lot more done. Now, it's harder to start, I will say that, but you get a lot more done to be able to do that. Next slide, please. So the final point we want to talk about out there is there we go. Who should be going? Compliance and pull the different stakeholders together. Very rarely do we see records now being run by just the records group. Or very rarely, or we're seeing a drift change from privacy programs are just run by the privacy group. Increasingly, we're seeing cross-functional steering committees. Now, there may be those individuals that are responsible for it, but a lot of the organizations that we're working with, the vast majority, have or are implementing these cross-functional groups to be able to tackle it. And the reason is you can't tackle privacy without also addressing records management, and you can't do defensible disposition with also touching on e-discovery. And we can't do any of these without understanding from the employees what's valuable and what's not valuable. And these are all very hard things for us to execute unless we have the technology, which obviously involves IT. And then we want to do behavior change management. We want to have the HR involved because that's a very important process. Again, sometimes when we're overwhelmed, it feels really easy to I'm just going to do this little part. And what I encourage you to do is start thinking about the big picture view, understand the needs to be done, then we'll break it into a number of little pieces. And we've seen a number of organizations that have been very, very successful with that. So again, work with many, many, many different organizations on that. And the final thing I'll say on this is that if you feel like, you're one of the few people in the organization that cares about this, or you're struggling, or can't get other stakeholders involved, or my employees are hoarders and they want to save everything forever, all I can say is you're not alone. Most organizations actually face those issues, but if you take the smart strategies, there is a way to not only reduce risk and ensure compliance, but also reduce cost and make everybody more productive. And so think about those. All right, back to you.
All right. Thanks so much, Mark. Yeah, look, aligning the stakeholders is an incredible necessity any longer. As you start to say, there is not one piece of data which you can't look at from multiple perspectives and that somebody will have an opinion upon, whether it has to be retained or disposed of. So I think sound, sage advice there. So I think wanted to touch on a few of the key takeaways from the presentation, and I'll run through these, and then hopefully got like a minute or two kind of left. But as we went through the entire presentation, I think it really brought out why I hope this is resonating with most of the folks. So reducing your organization's data risk really means that the data has to be managed effectively. I think that was resonated through Mark, Jay, and myself. But not more importantly, but one of the important points is really about needing to understand more about your data, really about how it's collected, where it's collected, how it's managed. So really very core, and a lot of that gets brought together with some of the governance that was Mark was speaking about. Firms need to address the affirmative obligations while still enforcing strong data minimization policies. I think Jay really articulated that very well. Legacy platforms, as I've described them, right, pose, I think, a unique risk to the organizations, and ones that, while not typically part of a governance strategy, really should be looked at because it's resonating risk, whether people recognize that immediately or not. The data retirement approach of which that I was speaking about is just one of in the arsenal of your possibilities in determining in how to better manage some of that risk, especially when you contemplate the value of data over time. There's practical approaches. I think Mark really kind of brought them about in his step-by-step plan. The key point there was about the behavioral change, right? And we talked about that in the beginning and at the end. Just taking away something means the underground archiving, as Mark called out, so that there is a very pragmatic kind of approach here. And last, well, not last, but siloed approaches. So ultimately, we've all talked about the need and the perspective of multiple functional teams and their perspective of that data. Bringing them all together really is effectively one of the good keys to success, by having the right people around the right table, having the right level of conversation to bring that forward. And last but not least, and this is where I think many of us struggle, don't let perfect get in the way of good. Start to make progress. And effectively, any progress is always a positive momentum, and then it builds upon itself. That brings us straight to the top of the hour. I guess I will ask the folks who are managing the forum if there were any questions, or how we wrap up.
I'm not sure if we have time for any more questions. Maybe we can fit one in real quick. What makes this uncomplicated is, oh wait, sorry, that's a comment. Can you explain how the business effectiveness can be reduced in respect of over retention of information by using an example? I think that's one for Jay.
Mark's going to take that one.
Okay.
I was going to say, well, the problem is that employees who hoard information, that just piles up and piles up and piles up. And they can't find their stuff. The average employee spends 6 hours per week looking, searching for files, for emails, for the right version. It's not 6 hours at once. It's 5 minutes here and 10 minutes there. Now that we've gone to the pandemic and hybrid environments where I used to be able to run down the hall, I got to call somebody if they're not around. Huge productivity impact because we have so much stuff out there. We don't know what's relevant, what's good. And again, we just get lost in the clutter. Now, there are a lot of other compliance risks that we talked about, but we find that on average that 6 hours can be cut in half. We could save 3 hours per employee per week if we're smarter. Jay?
You know, if customers want to know what data you have about them and it's all over the place, it takes a long time to respond. Or when I was an insurance compliance officer and the insurance department would ask us to produce 100 files about 100 policyholders, they thought we had all the information about each policyholder in one place. Would but that were true. So whether it's a customer request, whether it's a business need, or whether it's a regulator or a lawsuit issue, trying to find everything that you're being asked for is a lot more complicated if it's in a bunch of different places in 12 different formats, and it's very hard to find.
And to your point, Jay, there as well, chiming in a little bit, right, is about the fact is that is within the organization's custody and control. And one of the worst things that can happen to a firm is to be holding information that's relevant to a particular request or an inquiry and not turn that over.
Correct. Well, we used to get in trouble for that. Well, I shouldn't say that. That would happen to us from time to time. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So over retention, you know, again, is a critical point, you know, from multiple perspectives. You just heard three of them very quickly through the three of us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the informative section. Everyone, our speakers today were Jay Cohen, Mark Diamond, and Dan Manners. I'd like to give a special thanks to Archive 360 for making this webcast possible. This concludes our webcast. Thank you again for joining us, and goodbye.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you for joining.